Welcome. Thank you to the Mass Civic Learning Coalition for organizing this webinar, and thank you to David and Molly for moderating it. My name is John Dickson, and I've had the pleasure of teaching civics and government on the Cape for the last 23 years. Our purpose today is to discuss the challenges of doing civics projects in our current reality of remote learning. I will begin by giving you an overview of Project Citizen, the particular approach to grade 8 civics projects that our school has used for many years. I will then go over the challenges that we face this year in completing these projects and the strategies we use to overcome them. In reviewing these, I will explain why I expect to continue using these strategies, whatever form school may take going forward. Mostly, I hope all of you who are considering doing a civics project next year as part of your curriculum decide to go for it. All right. Project Citizen is a national program developed by the Center for Civic Education, which promotes competent and responsible participation in local and state government, helps participants learn how to monitor and influence public policy, and develops support for democratic values and principles, tolerance, and feelings of political efficacy. I was quoting that, which made me trip a little bit. It's not the only program out there. There are many. But I encourage you to look at these when planning a civics project. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. The picture on the right shows two students presenting an article for a plastic straw ban at Chatham Town Meeting last year, which passed. With Project Citizen, students advocate for a specific policy to address a social problem. They do this through 4 stages. First, they choose and research a problem. Next, they identify several policies that might address the problem. Then they choose one of those as their class policy. And last, they develop and implement an action plan to get their policy adopted. The picture shows a traditional Project Citizen 4-board presentation. The class divides into 4 groups and that each prepare and present one board. The picture on the right is of 2 students before the Harwich Board of Health asking them to adopt a flavored tobacco product ban a year ago, which it did months before the governor and legislature implemented this policy statewide. Project Citizen culminates in a formal presentation of the students' work. Each group presents their board to a panel of a group of around 3 judges who ask questions and give feedback for each group, and then score them on the sheet that you see to the right of the screen. Don't try to read the fine print. This document and a bunch more are in a folder that I am sharing with you. Molly, either Molly or David has put that up in the chat. So if you want to see this, just click on that and you will find it. The hearing is a great exercise in synthesizing and presenting the students' work, and they get a lot of positive feedback from the judges. As I will discuss more later, we moved this year to doing the hearing electronically using Google Slides and Google Meet. And this is a clip from Group 2 in my class this year that was addressing plastic pollution. Now, this is where we were having a little bit of a challenge on this. Oh, wait, no, I want to go back and let's see if I can hold on. All right, this is where I was having trouble getting the thing to play. So thank you for your forbearance. All right, that's what I need. Now you should be able to hear it.
Taken. Chatham and Harwich have taken some steps to reduce plastic. Chatham and Harwich have banned single-use plastic shopping bags. And also, Chatham and Harwich have both banned plastic straws last year at a town meeting because of the petition articles from one of our 8th grade classes, Project Citizen Project. We didn't choose to pursue a styrofoam ban, but we considered it. Styrofoam is extremely toxic to humans and the environment. It is estimated that less than 1% of it is recycled. It contains many chemicals that can cause health issues. These chemicals leach into our food and the soil. Maine just passed a law banning styrofoam, which will go into effect on January 1st of 2021. Some alternatives to styrofoam are mushroom material, plantable packaging, and bamboo fiber.
All right, so let me, oh, no. Take that. All right. Oh, this is what I did before. All right, so now the problem is now you're looking at my tabs. We had this problem before, which may mean I need to that, and then present, and now we're back to full screen. Okay, sorry about those little glitches. All right, so Project Citizen is a great way to meet the state's civics project mandate. To review DESI's 6 stages, we cover the first in our early units on philosophy, the Constitution, and political participation. We start Project Citizen's second quarter, then continue the work in parallel with our curriculum for the rest of the year. Choosing the problem they will tackle is stage 2. They do stage 3 as they learn about the problem and policy alternatives and adopt a policy. Then for stages 4 and 5, they develop an action plan and try to carry it out. Finally, they do a reflective essay and presentation as a capstone to the project. So Project Citizen pretty clearly meets DESI's requirements. All right. So let's talk about doing this in remote learning. Remote learning sucks, but we have to be ready to go forward in any of the 3 models outlined by Commissioner Riley. And the adaptations I used this year can be helpful in all of them. There are a few basic needs for doing this, which are similar to the needs for doing any remote learning. Student computers, internet access, regular online meetings, and an online platform such as Google Classroom. Some aspects of remote learning are difficult, such as the attendance problem. It is hard to make progress when half the class isn't there. But Google Classroom helps students get work done whether or not they were in the meeting, as they have to keep up with the assignments. Small group work is tough unless the schedule allows for breakout sessions and students show up for these. We relied more on breaking the group tasks into specific jobs that each student could do on their own. And action plans are hard to implement in a pandemic. One class this year was working on animal rights, and their action plan revolved around attending a lobby day organized by the Animal Rescue League that was to be March 25th. Oops. So they ended up participating in a Google Meet with 2 state representatives, which is not as much fun as a trip to Boston. However, with all our classes, we tried to keep moving forward, and we just had to fill in the gaps as they came up. Looking back, I feel like we were learning skills that will be helpful in the new normal, in a more digital world. There are 8 elements I will highlight. The examples I will use are mostly from the class that was doing plastic pollution this year, which we just heard Ashley presenting on. I'm going to skip, there's a number of short ones that I built in, hoping that this would be seamless. But as we saw with the last one, it wasn't. So I'm going to skip and just do one more later. If we have time at the end, we could watch a couple more as well. All right, let me, we'll go to the next slide. All right, one of the tools we used was Google Docs. Having our documents on a shared cloud-based format was critical. I used Google Classroom to assign a research document to each class where all the students compiled their information. This made it so each student could access all the research, not just their own. And group editing access to the final presentation on Google Slides was necessary. It is nerve-wracking for a teacher to give group access to a document. Someone may put up something inappropriate or delete someone else's work. But Google has a tool to help in the version history feature. You can go back to any version to recover work, and every edit is labeled. So on the document below, is their research document on plastic pollution. And to the right is a version history where I can see who made each edit. I can see all the names that edited that day there, and it's all color-coded, so I could determine. So if anyone did anything wrong at any point, it would be recorded, and I could figure out who did it. I make sure the students know about this feature to try and dissuade them from any temptations they may have. Another approach was to go to all online research. We used to schedule library days during the research phase of the project. Libraries are great, and librarians are often experts at finding information online. But student research day is relying almost exclusively on websites, and there are skills for them to learn to do this well. Students don't naturally know how to do a Google search. They need to learn what keywords to include, how to refine results, and how to look beyond the first page. They also learn about evaluating sources and identifying bias. These are essential skills for their future. Giving guidance and feedback on their research for the Civics project, even in remote learning, can further these goals. I adapted a form from Project Citizen for them to submit their research. You see Abby's on the left. And this is where I can give feedback. So I hope to have library days in the future, but these will be focused on finding and evaluating material online. We won't be relying on looking up things in encyclopedias anymore. A great thing to do as part of a civics project is to get some experts to talk to the students. These interviews can guide and inspire. It is surprising how willing people are to talk to students. We had a woman from the Animal Rescue League come all the way from Boston to speak to the kids for an hour in early March. During remote learning, this actually became easier since people could just join our Google Meet instead of driving to Harwich. We haven't pushed the boundaries yet, but now we can ask anyone anywhere for an interview. One tip is to work with the class on a specific agenda ahead of time so they get the info they need from the interview. Don't count on students asking questions unless they're prepared and assigned ahead of time. Also, it worked well for us to schedule these for 30 minutes to keep them focused. Longer would seem to be a little bit too long in an online format. The notes on the right are from an interview with a Northeastern professor who's been leading the group on the Cape for pushing plastic restrictions. And the screenshot below shows one of the things that I learned about this generation that seems to be different from recent ones. They don't like to be seen. Only the adults ever have their cameras and mics on. Unless directly asked, my students only responded by typing in the chat. So I have a clip where Jack presents a little bit from our notes, but as I said before, I'm going to avoid the non-seamless videos here until we get to the end. Another good tactic for a project is to do a survey. This gives the students a chance to present some original research. In brainstorming their questions, they learn about the importance of data. Their first questions are often narrative ones like, how big a problem do you think littering is? We then work on revising the question so it will give a result that can be useful for our research and presentation. We also limit it to 3 or 4 questions per survey to focus on what will be most useful. Doing this in remote learning meant relying on an online survey tool such as Google Forms or SurveyMonkey. These tools have the advantage of doing the analysis automatically, as you see on the right. These nicely made pie charts that were done by Google for me. For the survey, we took advantage of the captive audience we had, their fellow civics students in my 4 sections. One online assignment during quarantine was to take the 4 surveys, 1 for each class. And this got a decent completion rate. As you can see, we had 62 respondents. We used the results to highlight how many single-use plastic water bottles our families use and how many kids already use reusable water bottles. And again, I'm going to not do this brief clip of Connor telling us about that. All right. A challenge during remote learning was to manage the group work with minimal opportunities for collaboration. So at the beginning of our remote work, I produced documents that framed the task for each group and presented suggested roles. The students within each group reviewed their task and chose one of the jobs, which I added to the document and then posted on our Google Classroom, as you see on the right. Their next job was to review our research document for information that could be helpful to their slide and supplement that with more research. This is when they filled out the research forms you saw earlier. Remote learning forced us to be more specific than in the past about the work breakdown, but this seemed to make everyone's job clearer and avoid one person doing most of the work for the group. The biggest innovation for us was to go from the traditional Project Citizen presentation boards to a digital slideshow, as I mentioned. We had actually planned to do this before the quarantine. One of my colleagues had been to a national conference in the fall at which this topic was featured. We divided the slideshow by group and then had each student create their own slide. During the process, I used the speaker's notes section to give feedback on their drafts. You can see on the right Isaiah's draft and below his final slide. So in my notes here, I try to emphasize using bullets instead of sentences, as well as a few content things. And over here, you can see his revised slide, which did indeed move to more bullets. And I think is a pretty effective slide. All right. For the few kids, well, I tried to emphasize bullets for all of them. They did not all take the revision advice as well as Isaiah did. There were a few kids, of course, who were pretty checked out during remote learning. And so what did we do with that? What did we do with the kid who had a slide in there but hadn't put anything on it? Well, ultimately, I had to create like a filler slide. I had to fill the gap. So there were a few slides, I think there was 2 or 3 slides in each of the classes that I ultimately had to create because those students just were not participating. And again, there's another clip of Isaiah explaining that slide that we're going to skip for now. One of the last steps before the presentation is the reflection essay. This is where students get a chance to synthesize the learning from their project. They reflect on what they learned about government and what they learned about our topic and how the process went. Essay writing is one of the most important skills our students take from us as they advance in school. Usually, I would have them work on it in class, so I could go around to each kid and see how they're doing. Remote learning, of course, makes this difficult. Fortunately, I had developed a scaffold for essay writing that I call an outline frame. It gives them a series of prompts as suggested points to discuss in each paragraph. They write 1 or 2 sentences for each prompt and can adapt the prompts as they want. Then when they remove the prompts, they have a rough draft that they then revise and submit as the essay. I have found this approach helpful for 8th graders. I didn't use this when I used to teach seniors. This seemed to work out for remote learning as the essay completion rate for all the classes was about the same as it was for all the other essays this year. The final challenge was to do a remote presentation. Having 2 or 3 rehearsals was important. We were able to establish some protocols such as turning their mics on for their slide. We also chose some kids who would be pinch hitters to present the slides for those whose attendance was erratic or worse. I also presented them with the kinds of questions they might be asked by the judges. For example, if a student presenting an alternative policy, they should be prepared to answer why we did not choose that as our class policy. I also, one protocol we set was not recording the presentation. Students did not want the added pressure of having to relive their performances after. I'll explain the discrepancy in a minute as to why I do have a recording, even though that was part of our protocol not to record it. Also, I had to recruit some judges. The other social studies teachers were unavailable since our remote schedule was organized by subject, so they were all teaching when we were doing the presentations. Fortunately, we have an English teacher who has done this a lot and was available. And I reached out to the state project citizen coordinator, and she was willing to do it and recruited some others. There are a lot of retired teachers around, many of whom help with that. So I had expert judges, but you could do this with anyone who can use a rubric, the rubric I showed you earlier. For the big day, I invited parents to attend, and a bunch did, though I had to mute a few mics. The presentations all went smoothly, and the positive feedback from the judges really gave the kids a sense of accomplishment. I have to share one hiccup. For one class as we started, my most faithful attendee wasn't on the meet. Just before we began, I asked another student to text her. Well, all pandemic, she had been nannying her little brother and sister, and that day they locked her out of the house. Fortunately, she got back in just in time to present her slide. So again, this clip is part of one that's I have at the very end, and I think we'll have time to watch that, but that way I won't have to do the transition one extra time. So let me, I'm gonna skip over this clip also. But I should explain how I have a recording. And that is after our presentations, the state coordinator asked me to submit this presentation on the plastic water bottle ban to the national showcase. Now, I think that may have been because we were the only ones that she was aware of who completed Project Citizen this year in Massachusetts. So the students agreed to record it in order for it to be submitted to the national showcase. And we did this in the second to last class of the year, so my attendance for that one was not as good as for the actual presentation, which was at the end of May. This clip was actually the conclusion. Like I say, I think we'll be able to watch this as part of the clip at the end. All right. So my conclusion for all of you contemplating doing a civics project next year is to go for it. I can't say enough about the value of the project. It is authentic learning at its best. Students learn about policy and policy making, and they own it because they choose the policy. They learn about state and local government, which is too often neglected as that unit at the end of the year that you might or might not get to. And if you help them follow through in the action plan, they may get the satisfaction of making real change. As I mentioned before, last year's classes got plastic straw bans and flavored vape products banned in Harwich and Chatham. This year, we hope to ban the sale of plastic water bottles, get a local bridge named to honor veterans, get animal rights bills passed by the state legislature, and support the introduction of a full-time vape detection dog at school. Most importantly, especially during remote learning, a civics project is highly motivational. In a normal year, Project Citizen holds a state showcase at the State House, and the class with the best score at our school gets to go. On this slide are some pictures from last year's state showcase. So doing well as a class has a possible reward for them. This year, my daily attendance increased when we were doing the project and peaked on the day of the presentation. I will always remember one student who had been checked out all quarantine. He had maybe come to one meet and hadn't handed in a single assignment since we had left school. I had created his slide, a slide for his slot, because he hadn't done anything. And at every practice, one of the other kids pinch hit for him. So we had our pinch hitter all lined up. Then on the big day, there he was. When his turn came, he unmuted and read the slide I wrote. I never saw him again at another meet, but it was at least something. Then in the last assignment of the year, I gave them a class evaluation. And when asked what was the best part of the course, a sizable majority said Project Citizen, even in this remote learning process. This is what they're going to remember most out of the class, is going through this process. So despite the uncertainties we face next year and the challenges of remote learning, I urge you to go for it. Oh, and it's a state mandate anyway. So let me go to the next slide, and I'm going to show you this clip, which includes the sort of the last few minutes of our presentation. So I think we have enough time, unless, David, you tell me otherwise. Do we have time to show about a 3-minute clip? I'm going to take that as a yes.
Yep, and also John.
Okay. All right. So I just have to, there's this floating bar that sometimes shows up down here. So I can get the audio over. If I get there, that's it. Oh, I have to be very careful. So I'm going to go to the right audio and then press play on
that. Class policy. Why single-use bottles are bad. Too much plastic is being wasted on single-use water bottles. About 70 million plastic water bottles are being bought and drank by Americans each day. The majority of the single-use water bottles do not get recycled afterwards. Only about 3 out of 10 single-use plastic water bottles actually get recycled, meaning that 70% of the single-use plastic water bottles get dumped in a landfill, littered, or dumped in the ocean. In order to stop the problem of single-use water bottles, our class has proposed a ban that specifically targets single-use plastic water bottles.
Very good. And can you read this one too?
Proposed bylaw to plan to ban their sale. We are supporting this proposal at our town meetings. Effective on September 1st, 2021, shall be allowed to sell non-carbonated, unflavored drinking water in single-use plastic water bottles of less than 1 gallon in the town of Harwich and Chatham. An exception is allowed if there is an emergency that affects the availability of town drinking water.
Okay, very good. Jordan.
Using reusable water bottles or town water has many more advantages than using single-use water bottles. Bottled water costs much more than town water or reusable water bottles. Also, using town water or reusable water bottles is much better for the environment. Town water is tested much more frequently than bottled water, and plastic used to make single-use bottles can contain chemicals that have negative health effects. On the right, the graph shows how much more single-use water bottles cost than tap water.
Very good. And can you do this one too?
Places that have passed bans. In 2013, Concord passed a bill to ban plastic waste. It has been very successful, and plastic use in Concord has gone down substantially in the past 7 years. In result of this ban, the town has added more water fountains around Concord since 2013. The first place to ban plastic bottles was the University of St. Louis in 2009.
Very good. Jack, you can lead us in.
Group 4, Action Plan. Our plan is to partner with Sustainable Practices. They're an organization that was formed in Cape Cod in 2017, and their goal is to reduce the impact that humans have on the environment. The municipal bottle ban they initiated last year was adopted by 11 of 15 Cape Cod towns. This year, they are starting a commercial bottle ban, which we are supporting.
Very good. Annalise.
We live in a very small community, so talking to people and encouraging them to support this article is key to having it pass. Many citizens might not understand just how bad the plastic issue is. Our hope is that once they realize how much of a negative impact plastic has on the environment, they will be quick to support a plastic water bottle ban.
Okay. And can you do this one too?
Yeah. Use social media tell people about plastic and why it's bad. Use reusable water bottles to show our classmates a better option. Talk to friends and classmates about using less plastic and how you can cut down.
Very good. And Isaiah, can you finish it off?
Metal water bottles instead of plastic could save or solve many problems with pollution. Cape Cod is uniquely impacted by plastic. The Cape is surrounded by water, and a lot of plastic litter ends up in the water. Plastic bottles could have many problems, and even if you are careful to recycle, the plastic causes health and waste problems. Our survey shows us that most of us use reusable water bottles for water already. Let's make that all of us.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. Very.
So John, this is great. Thank you for sharing your work with your students.
No problem.
Really want to thank you for presenting this afternoon. Was there anything you wanted to say just to wrap up that video?
I honestly, I was thrilled with how it came out. At the beginning of quarantine, when we had to decide whether we were going to try and follow through on this, it definitely felt like a leap into the unknown. Like, this may work or it may totally fall flat. I imagine, like a lot of you, in being in quarantine or teaching remote learning, sort of made me feel like a first-year teacher all over again, in that I had no idea what was going to work and what wasn't going to work. I just could only try things. But I really was thrilled that we did it. I was thrilled with how the kids responded. And again, despite all the frustrations of it, this was a real highlight for our class. Like I say, it really was the highlight of the year, being able to follow this through to the end. So I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, so thanks again. It does look like there's some questions in the chat, and I'd encourage any of you who are participating in this to feel free to add additional questions here. Looks like the questions are sort of some around Project Citizen itself, as well as some around the ways, the process that you used in making the projects happen. So I'm going to turn it over to Molly here to talk us through a couple of the questions, and we'll hear some more about how you proceed with all this.
Sure. So the first question that we have is from Adam, and he wants to know if this was a year-long project and when you introduced it to your students.
So I introduced it at the beginning of the year, but we didn't start any work on it until middle of second quarter. We did our first few units. We have our year divided into 8 units essentially, and we do 2 units a quarter. So we did our philosophy unit, our constitution unit, and our political participation unit. And then we introduced it as part of our, we started the work in conjunction with our Congress unit, partly because I used a model Congress exercise to get them to start to think about possible proposals and actually try and pass those through a model Congress exercise. So it was all part of that beginning to think about policy and how to get policy passed. From there, we would go back and forth. We would do some of the early decision work on it, then we get back to the unit and finish the Congress unit, and similarly going back and forth on the executive branch unit, and then our judicial branch and civil liberties, civil rights unit as well. And then after that, we then kind of focused on it for, and this was during remote learning, for a few weeks until we got all the way through the presentation, and then came back and followed up with this unit on state and local government, which you know, they had already learned a lot about in the process of it. So it is kind of a year-long thing. There are different, I mean, there's other ways of doing it. The only thing I would caution is that there's some dates you're going to want to be aware of, such as when is the deadline to get an article onto the town meeting warrant. It varies by town. Every town is different. But it only takes 10 signatures to get on the town meeting warrant. So you don't want to miss that. You don't want to have your policy being to put something at a town meeting and then miss the opportunity to actually get it on town meeting. So to that extent, you'll want to know at the beginning of the year what those dates are so you can make sure you hit those decision points. Similarly, the best time to introduce something into the state legislature it's in January every year. There's usually 1 or 2 week window when you can get a bill submitted through your legislator in sort of regular order, which guarantees that it'll get a public hearing in committee. So again, these are the kind of dates that it's worth knowing at the beginning so you can kind of time around them.
Great. The next question is more about Project Citizen for this, for the Project Citizen model. Does your entire class pick one topic and then break down into smaller groups that do specific aspects of that topic?
Yeah, so for a Project Citizen, and at least this is, I don't know if any people do it differently, but my understanding and what we've done is that that class will do one topic. We'll pick one problem, we'll brainstorm alternative policies, and we'll choose one class policy. And then we'll break into 4 groups that will end up presenting the problem, the alternate policies, the class policy, and the action plan. So I had 4 different civic sections. They all did different things. And we also had 4 other civic sections. They were all doing different things. But each class is doing one problem and adopts one class policy. It's interesting how different classes, sometimes come to a consensus very quickly, and sometimes it's not as easy for a class to come to a consensus. But that in itself is a good exercise as well.
Yeah, can you actually, the next question is asking you to talk more about that brainstorming process and how your class selected the projects that they did?
Yeah, so I went to a seminar that the head of the state Project Citizen, Ellen Barbara Morse, gave. This was a few years ago. I used to teach senior government before a few years ago, flipping over to when our 8th grade civics class came up. So what she taught us at the seminar, which worked really well, was to get the kids to brainstorm, to come up with a bunch of alternatives, and then put all those alternatives on the board and give the kids either 3 stickers, or I had them use these whiteboard markers and just, check 3 of them. So each kid got to pick 3 of those as things they'd like to consider. And then we looked at all the checks and then used that to narrow our list of 10 problems down to 3. And then I had them do some research on one of the 3 and then present their research to the class just briefly so we could get a sense of what we were able to find out about these problems. And then after reviewing that research, choose and vote as one vote for one of them. And I think I made them write like a paragraph to do it. And I think in that folder is, I think it says like paragraph vote or something like that as a document. And that was the way I had them vote on which was the problem. And then it was a similar process to, go through their research. We didn't do it quite as formal, though we could, in terms of putting possible policies up and then having them vote among those policies as to which one was going to be our class policy. The biggest step is deciding what is your problem going to be, what is really the topic of it going to be. And so that formal process that Ellen taught me has been really useful.
Great, thank you. A couple other questions. Who find that adult decision makers were available remotely to hear students and consider proposals?
So I'm sorry, I didn't hear the beginning of that. So did we find that?
Did you find that adult decision makers were available remotely?
Yes, and they're really willing to. So we had our local state representative who's actually on the leadership team, Sarah Peak, but I've known her for years, and she's a Democrat, but we also happen to have a Republican who lives in my town of Brewster and represents Brewster, and they work together in a lot of things. So we managed to schedule a meet with both of them, which was very kind of Representative Whalen, since we're not in his district. But it was nice to be able to have a bipartisan, discussion. And yeah, they put me in touch with their schedulers. Now, it wasn't because they weren't busy. In fact, it was really tight to be able to schedule them. During the pandemic, our legislators, especially early on, were incredibly busy. I know from talking to them that they had, because they were part of sort of county meetings on everything, they were part of local meetings on everything, and they were part of all the state meetings on trying to figure out what to do. But despite that, they made themselves available. And I have never, that I can think of right now, I've never asked someone, I never had the student say, or, you know, this would be, we should talk to this group, let's see if we can, and then I write an email. I've never had anyone say no. Everyone's always said yes, and that included during the pandemic. People who we had scheduled things that were going to be in class were then all happy to do it on a Google Meet as well. So yeah, no, people are really, I think for a lot of people, it's a nice break in their day to talk to some students. You know, so I think people really value, they're honored to be asked, and they really go out of their way to make time for students, especially if it's about an issue they care about.
Sure. And then the next question is about other units or projects you might have been doing for remote learning. Was this was most of the time of remote learning, was this project?
So when we went into remote learning for us, we were in the middle of a unit on the judiciary, civil liberties, and civil rights. And actually, I was in the middle of a group project where kids were going to present a Supreme Court case and argue that case before the court. So that was my first challenge, was to try and adapt that group project and somehow figure out how to finish that off in remote learning. But we completed that unit. Then we turned and did the Project Citizen for the next few weeks, maybe it was 3 or 4 weeks. And then we spent the last few weeks doing state and local government. So those were kind of in thirds, but Project Citizen was probably a little bit more than a third of that. It's probably about half of the time we spent during our remote learning.
Great, thank you. And the next question is from Jocelyn, and she's kind of asking about maybe connecting with you offline. So I'll probably just give you that email address later.
Yeah, if I can just say it. It's just jdickson, DICKSON @monomoy.edu, and I'm happy to share any resources I have with people.
Great, thank you.
No problem.
Question from Susan, asking if you could project topics that you've done in the past, and so how local do you think the project has to be?
So the guideline for state, for Project Citizen, is it should be local or state. It shouldn't be national. Now, I mean, I guess if I had a class that was determined that they were going to, I don't know, do some national issue, I probably wouldn't. I'd probably try to talk them out of it, but if that's what they wanted to do, I guess we could try it. But it can be school. A lot of times it's stuff in school. So the vape, we've had classes the last couple of years wanting to do vaping. I mean, do the issue of vaping. That's a good one because it affects them directly. And one of the alternate policies that we considered was asking our school to fund vape detectors in the bathrooms. But in our research, we found that those schools that had implemented that we talked to, had kind of a mixed experience with it. It had not been a kind of panacea that solved the problem. There's a lot of logistics about, okay, a detector goes off. Where's the nearest administrator? Who is that being alerted? Where's the nearest administrator? How long does it take them to get there? And are they actually catching people when they do that? Which in many cases they weren't. And they're expensive. So last year's class ended up coming up with the idea, in talking to the county tobacco control folks in our interview that year, was the idea of a flavored tobacco ban. And as, of course, later in the year that became state policy. This year, the class found out about a proposal from our school resource officer to have a dog on campus, to get a trained vape detector dog that would be trained to detect nicotine and THC. They had actually, in part of the process in discussing it with them, they had considered having it be able to detect alcohol also. But I guess experience of schools that have done that elsewhere in the country, I'm not sure anyone in Massachusetts has done this yet, but was that if they're trained on alcohol, you get a lot of false positives from perfume or from other things. So there are things that kids may have that legitimately have alcohol. Actually, probably now hand sanitizer would be a big thing that that the dog would alert to. So we became involved in supporting that proposal. Again, mostly it was really being mostly driven by the school resource officer. But, so you can be all about stuff that's happening in school, and that is a really good topic. It can be local, like our plastic water bottle ban and our plastic straw ban. It can be regional. One of the classes last year did shark attacks, and their class policy was to try and advocate for shark detection buoys to be and stop the bleed kits to be placed at every beach. And it can be statewide. Gosh, don't let me. Well, there's one of the classes this year is trying to get a bridge named to honor that they want to call the Hidden Wounds Memorial Bridge in Harvard. So it's a local bridge, but it's a state legislative act that has to make it happen. And the ones doing animal rights, those bills were statewide rights on kennel regulations and banning the adoptions under 8 weeks and a few things like that. So it can fill that range very easily, the state, the local, the regional, and the school. But I would try and dissuade them if they're trying to do something that's national.
So John, toward the end of our time here.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to wrap up with one more question. If you could get back to us on this. A lot of people have been asking both on this session and elsewhere about how you coordinate with local officials to give them a heads up that students are doing this kind of project and to sort of coordinate and grease the ways so that they can participate in the project as effectively as possible. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's an excellent point to bring up. Yeah, you don't want to, I don't know, walk into your state representative's office with a bill in hand saying submit this, though you have a right to actually under our state legislative rules that you can actually force them to submit a bill even if they don't like it. But that's not a good approach. I don't recommend that. But yeah, it's just the moment that you get a sense that once you've chosen your topic and they've brainstormed some policies, it does help as a teacher to try and see the end game and say, okay, I think this is going to involve our state legislators. Let me reach out to them. I think this is going to involve a town meeting article. Let me email the town clerk just to make sure I'm clear on the deadlines. And one of the interesting things last year, the flavored tobacco ban, we originally submitted it as a warrant article and then learned that though it was under the purview of the town's Board of Health, and as a Board of Health policy, it actually was not subject to town meeting review, which I had no idea. I didn't realize that there were some areas that town meeting actually couldn't pass policies on. So we had to then change from we had to withdraw that article and instead submit a petition to the town Board of Health. But yeah, as early as possible to start reaching out to the appropriate policymakers. It really does help the process along.
All right, so John, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And thanks for sharing all your work with your students. I think it takes a lot of courage for any of us as teachers to be out in public as much as this is, to share what you've done. And I really appreciate the courage and the work you put into developing this session. So thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It is a pleasure. I'm a huge advocate for civics and civic projects. So I'm glad to answer anyone's emails that may have other questions about how to make it happen.
So I want to make sure we all give John a virtual round of applause. If you can all join me with that.
Thank you.
Which, if you could just move to the next slide for a second.
Oh, I'm still on this. Oh, yes.
Wrap up
Yes,
our,
that's the
our
wrap up.
session here.
Oh,
Yep.
okay, there you go.
Yep. So I just want to thank all of you for attending today. Hopefully this was a useful session for you. We've been doing a series as a coalition on a number of topics related to remote learning, trying to make this as relevant and useful to all of you as possible. We're going to continue with the series focusing on remote learning, but may shift to some other topics. We hope to also expand some more on this approaches to doing civics projects remotely, since that's certainly a very pressing issue for everybody across the state. So do stay tuned for future notices about upcoming webinars in the future. Most likely those will be later in July and in August. And we hope to have a session eventually late in the summer about doing some approaches, thinking about approaches to beginning the new school year with all the challenges and unknowns that are facing us as we enter the new school year. So thanks again for joining us today. We'll be back in touch with you with an email and all links for this session, as well as a recording of this session as well. So you'll have access to that. So thanks again, and all the best for a summer well earned. We hope you all get a little bit of time to relax and regroup before the big new year comes on us. So thanks again, and we'll be back in touch with you and look forward to seeing you on a future webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.